The hall goes quiet the moment I raise my hand, and I like that. 300 warriors of the Queen's swarm are watching me, and every one of them wants to hear the story again. I do not blame them. It is a good story. It is my story. Say it again, Vorak. Someone shouts from the back. Tell us about the colony. I let the silence stretch a little longer than it needs to. Timing matters. My old commander taught me that a story told too fast is a story wasted. There were 40 of them, I say. 40 humans behind a wall of scrap metal, thinking it would stop us. I walked through their gate alone. No support, no cover, just me. A younger warrior near the front, barely out of his hatching cycle, leans forward with his mandibles clicking in excitement. And they ran? They screamed first, I say, and the hall laughs the way it always does. Then they ran. Humans are built wrong. No shell, no venom, no claws worth mentioning. They fight with machines because their bodies cannot fight at all. Take away their guns and they are nothing, less than nothing. I have told this story maybe 200 times since the war began, and each time it grows a little braver, a little bigger. 40 humans becomes 50. My solo walk through the gate becomes a battle against impossible odds. Nobody checks. Nobody asks for proof. The hive does not reward accuracy. It rewards glory, and I have more of it than almost anyone in this fleet. My name carries weight now. Vorak Thessendai, killer of humans, favored son of the second swarm. When I walk through the feeding halls, warriors step aside. When I speak in the war councils, even the older commanders listen. I earned every bit of that respect on human blood, or so I tell myself, and so everyone believes. But there is one warrior who never laughs at my stories. His name is Creel, and he sits at the edge of every gathering with his arms crossed, watching me the way a predator watches something it has not decided whether to trust. Tonight, he finally speaks. You keep saying they are weak, Krill says, loud enough for the whole hall to hear. If they are so weak, why has the third swarm lost 2 entire ships in the last cycle alone? The hall goes tense in an instant. This is not how these gatherings usually go. Nobody interrupts the storyteller. Nobody questions the numbers. I turn to face him, and I make sure my voice stays calm, almost bored, because that is more cutting than anger ever could be. Bad commanders lose ships, Krill, not strong enemies. There is a difference. Is there? He says, because I have read the reports from the frontier. The humans do not scream and run anymore. They dig in. They build weapons faster than we can counter them. They learn. A few warriors shift uncomfortably. I feel their eyes moving between us, waiting to see who will back down first. I will not be the one. You have read reports, I say. I have stood in their blood. I know which one of us understands the humans better. That gets the laugh I wanted, and Creel's mandibles tighten in frustration. He knows he has lost the room, at least for tonight. But something in the way he looks at me before he walks away sticks with me longer than it should. It is not anger in his eyes. It is pity. I try to shake the feeling off, but it follows me back to my quarters like a shadow that will not fall away in the dark. 3 days later, the announcement comes. The Queen herself, speaking through the great crystal projection in the command spire, tells us of a new target, a human world called Aldrin Station, a fortified colony on the edge of contested space. It is not a small settlement like the ones I have bragged about. It is a stronghold, built to hold the line against exactly this kind of attack. The commanders call for volunteers to lead the first wave. I do not hesitate. My hand is up before the Queen finishes speaking. This is exactly the kind of glory I need. A stronghold instead of a scattered colony. A real battle instead of the small skirmishes I have been embellishing for cycles. If I can take Aldrin Station, no one will ever question my stories again. Not Krill, not anyone. The commander who reviews the volunteer list looks at me for a long moment before nodding. You understand what you are asking for, Vorak. Aldrin is not like the outposts you have taken before. Intelligence suggests a full military garrison, not settlers. Good, I say, and I mean it. Settlers do not make for good stories. He does not smile at that the way I expect him to. Instead, he simply logs my name and moves on to the next volunteer, and something about his silence bothers me more than any argument Creel could have made. That night, I stand at the viewport of my quarters and look out at the stars, scattered across the black like scattered grain. Somewhere out there is Aldrin Station, and somewhere on it are humans who have never heard my name, who owe me no fear, who will meet me for the first time with no story standing between us. For the first time since the war began, a small and unfamiliar feeling settles into my chest. I tell myself it is excitement. I tell myself it is the thrill of a real fight finally within reach. I do not let myself consider that it might be doubt, because doubt is not something a warrior with my reputation is allowed to feel. Not in front of others, not even alone in the dark of my own quarters, staring at a star I cannot yet name, waiting for the day I will learn exactly how wrong I have been. The transport ships begin loading at dawn cycle, thousands of warriors moving in disciplined lines, checking weapons, checking armor, checking the confidence on each other's faces, the way soldiers everywhere do before a fight they know will be hard. I check mine in the reflective plating of my own ship and find it exactly where I left it, steady and sure. Creel finds me on the boarding ramp before we leave. I expect another argument. Instead, he simply says 4 words that I do not understand until much later. Be careful what you claim. Then he turns and walks toward his own transport, leaving me standing there with my confidence slightly, imperceptibly cracked, like a shell that has taken one small hit it has not yet noticed. I climb aboard my ship, take my place among my unit, and watch through the narrow viewport as the stars begin to shift and blur, carrying us closer to Aldrin Station and to a version of the war I have never actually seen with my own eyes, no matter how many times I have described it to others. The fleet drops out of transit above a pale blue world, and my first look at Aldrin Station tells me nothing about what is waiting for me below its clouds. From orbit, it looks small, almost fragile, a single ring of metal and light against a dark green continent. It does not look like a stronghold, it looks like an easy target, exactly the kind of story I have already begun composing in my head. I do not yet know how wrong that first impression will turn out to be. As our transport begins its descent, I run through the story one more time in my mind, the one I will tell when this is over. Vorak Thessendai, who took Aldrin Station alone, who walked into the heart of humanity's best defense and came out the other side untouched. The ship shudders as it breaks through the atmosphere, and somewhere below us, hidden in the pale green haze, the humans are already watching us arrive. I feel no fear at the thought, only a warrior's eagerness, sharp and bright, for a fight I still believe I already understand. I have been wrong about many things in my life, but I have never been more wrong than I am in this moment, convinced that the hardest part of this war is already behind me, when in truth, it has not yet even begun. The landing zone erupts in fire before our boots even touch the ground. I have led landings before, dozens of them, and every single one of them followed the same pattern. We would drop from the sky, the defenders would fire a few desperate shots, and within minutes the ground would belong to us. Aldrin Station does not follow that pattern. Aldrin Station breaks it apart within the first 10 seconds. The transport door has barely opened when the first volley hits our formation. Not scattered fire, not panic, but a coordinated wall of defense that seems to know exactly where we will land before we land there. 3 warriors beside me go down before I even clear the ramp. I have never seen a human force move like this, precise and calm, like a single creature instead of a scattered collection of soft, fragile bodies. I dive for cover behind a ridge of broken stone, and for the first time since this war began, I feel something I do not have a story for. My hearts are pounding faster than they should. My claws are shaking slightly against the rock. Formation! I shout to my unit, but half of them are already scattered, already returning fire toward positions that keep shifting before we can properly target them. The humans are not standing in open ground the way I have always described them doing. They are moving between prepared defenses, falling back in careful stages, letting us advance only far enough to walk into narrower and narrower kill zones. By the time we push into the outer ring of the station, my unit has lost nearly a third of its warriors, and we have not even reached the first checkpoint. I press my back against a metal barricade and try to steady my breathing. Around me, younger warriors look to me for direction the way they always have, expecting the same calm confidence I have shown in every story I have told. I give it to them, because that is what a leader does, but underneath it, something in me has started to crack. This is not what I described in the feeding halls. This is not 40 frightened settlers behind a wall of scrap metal. This is an enemy that studies us, that adapts in real time, that seems to know our tactics almost before we use them. We push forward through the following hours in small, costly steps. Every position we take, the humans have already prepared a second line behind it. Every ambush we set, they seem to expect. I begin to notice something strange in the pattern of their resistance. It is not random. It is not desperate. It is disciplined in a way that reminds me, uncomfortably, of our own training. At the edge of a supply depot, I finally see them clearly for the first time. A squad of human soldiers, moving in a tight formation through the ruins of a shattered wall. They are smaller than us, exactly as small and soft as I have always described. But there is nothing weak in the way they move. They cover each other without hesitation, falling back and advancing in a rhythm that looks almost rehearsed, like a dance they have practiced 1,000 times. One of them, a woman with short dark hair and a scar along her jaw, directs the others with sharp hand signals instead of words, and within seconds, their formation shifts to counter our flanking attempt before we have even fully committed to it. I order my unit to charge the position directly, hoping that raw numbers will break their discipline the way it always has before. It does not. They fall back in careful stages, using the terrain, using each other, drawing us deeper into a corridor lined with hidden defenses that erupt the moment we are fully inside it. I lose 4 more warriors in the space of a few heartbeats, and I barely manage to pull the rest of us back before the corridor becomes a trap none of us walk out of. By the time the first day's fighting ends, my unit has been cut down to less than half its original number, and Aldrin Station still stands exactly as strong as it did this morning. That night, in a makeshift shelter carved into the ruins we managed to hold, I sit apart from the others and try to make sense of what I have seen. The younger warriors around me are quiet, in a way they have never been after a battle before. No one is telling stories tonight. No one wants to. I think of Creel, back on the fleet, and the 4 words he said to me before we left. Be careful what you claim. I did not understand them then. I am beginning to understand them now, in a way that feels like a slow crack spreading through something I always believed was solid. The next day brings no relief. If anything, the humans grow more effective, not less, as though every mistake they made yesterday has already been corrected by morning. I watch them adjust their defensive lines overnight, watch them redistribute their forces to cover the exact weaknesses we exploited only hours before. No enemy I have fought has ever learned this quickly. No enemy I have described in my stories has ever learned at all. During a push toward the central spire of the station, I find myself pinned behind a collapsed wall alongside a warrior barely older than a hatchling, someone who joined my unit specifically because of the stories I told about easy human prey. He looks at me now with wide, frightened eyes, waiting for reassurance I am no longer certain I can honestly give him. They are supposed to break, he says, more to himself than to me. You said they always break. I do not have an answer for him. Above us, human fire continues in short, disciplined bursts, never wasted, never panicked. Somewhere beyond the wall, I hear the same woman's voice from yesterday, calm and clear, directing her soldiers through what should be, by every measure I have always claimed, an impossible defense against overwhelming numbers. It is not impossible. It is working. By the 3rd day, command orders a change in strategy. Instead of a direct assault on the central spire, we are to encircle the outer districts and cut off their supply lines. a slower and more cautious approach than anything I have led before. I recognize the shift for what it is. Even the commanders, safe in orbit, have begun to understand that Aldrin Station is not the easy victory anyone expected. During the encirclement, my unit is separated from the main force by a sudden human counterattack, one that comes from a direction our scouts marked as clear only hours earlier. In the chaos, half my remaining warriors scatter into the ruins, and I find myself cut off, alone, in a district I no longer recognize, listening to human voices moving somewhere close in the wreckage around me. I press myself into the shadow of a fallen support beam and try to steady my breathing, the way I have taught countless young warriors to do before battle, the way I describe doing so calmly in stories that now feel impossibly distant from what I am actually feeling. For the first time in this entire war, I am afraid, and I am completely alone with that fear, unable to boast it away in front of an audience that wants only the version of me that never loses. Footsteps approach from my left, careful, measured, unmistakably human. I raise my weapon and turn to face whatever is coming, telling myself this is simply another skirmish, another story waiting to be told once it is over. I do not yet know that the fight waiting for me around that corner will end differently than any I have ever survived before, and that the human standing there will change everything I believe about the war I claimed, for so long, to already understand completely. The footsteps stop just around the edge of the beam, close enough that I can hear breathing that is not my own. I raise my weapon, my claws tight around the grip, and step out to meet whatever is waiting. There are 3 of them. A tall man with cropped brown hair standing slightly ahead of the others, a younger soldier crouched low with a scanning device in his hands, and behind them both, the woman with the scar along her jaw that I saw directing her squad the day before. Up close, she looks even smaller than I expected, and yet nothing about her posture suggests fear. For a moment, none of us move. I could fire. I am fast enough, strong enough, and at this range I would likely take at least one of them down before they could properly respond. It is exactly the kind of moment I have described 100 times in the feeding halls, the lone warrior facing impossible odds and winning through skill and nerve alone. Instead, my legs will not move, and I do not entirely understand why. "Lower it," the woman says, her voice calm in a way that unsettles me more than shouting would have. "You are already surrounded. Look up." I do not want to look away from her, but instinct pulls my eyes upward anyway, and I see what I somehow missed before. 2 more soldiers positioned on a broken ledge above us, weapons already trained on me from an angle I cannot easily counter. I have walked directly into a position with no clean way out. "You could still try," the woman continues, reading the calculation running behind my eyes. "But I don't think you will. Warriors who talk as much as your kind usually prefer to stay alive long enough to keep talking." The comment lands harder than I expect, and something in my chest tightens with an emotion I do not recognize until later. It is shame, though I am not yet willing to call it that. I lower my weapon, not out of surrender exactly, but because some part of me, buried beneath all the stories I have told, understands that this fight is already over before it began. They move quickly and efficiently, restraining my arms with a material I do not recognize, strong enough to hold even against my strength. Nobody shouts, nobody strikes me, even though I have certainly done far worse to warriors I have captured in smaller skirmishes before. The younger soldier scans me carefully, calling out readings to the others in short, clipped phrases, and within minutes I am being escorted deeper into the ruins rather than executed on the spot, exactly as Hive doctrine always taught me humans would never bother to do. "Why not just end it here?" I ask, more out of confusion than defiance. "You have no reason to keep me breathing." The woman glances back at me, and for the first time I notice something almost like curiosity in her expression, not the hatred I always assumed humans reserved for warriors like me. "Because you might actually be useful alive," she says. "And because we're not what you've clearly been told we are. We travel through a series of tunnels beneath the ruined district, passages clearly built long before this war began, wide enough for equipment and supplies to move unseen beneath the surface fighting above. It becomes clear to me, walking through this hidden network, that Aldrin Station was never the fragile settlement command believed it to be. It was built to survive exactly this kind of siege from the very beginning. Eventually we reach a lower chamber, converted into some kind of medical and command station, lit by soft artificial light and lined with equipment I do not recognize. They remove my restraints only enough to treat a wound along my side that I had not even fully noticed until now, a graze from the earlier fighting that has been quietly bleeding beneath my armor. The younger soldier tends to it with careful, practiced movements, and I watch him work in confused silence. In every story I have ever told, this is the moment where the human either flees in terror or attacks out of desperate hatred. Instead, he simply finishes his work, checks the readings on his scanning device, and steps back without a single word of cruelty. "You're patching me up," I say, unable to keep the disbelief out of my voice. "You're a prisoner of value," the woman answers from across the room, arms crossed, watching me with the same unreadable expression from before. Dead prisoners don't answer questions. She finally introduces herself as Sergeant Grace Whitfield, and something about hearing a human name spoken plainly, without any of the fear or contempt I always described humans reacting with, settles uncomfortably into my chest. "You're the one they've been talking about," she continues, pulling a datapad from a nearby console. "Vorak, killer of colonies. We've had your name flagged in our intelligence reports for cycles now." Pride flares briefly in me, an old and familiar feeling, easy to reach for even here. "Then you already know what I am capable of." "I know what you claim to be capable of," she says, and something in her tone makes the pride curdle almost instantly. "There's a difference, and I think you're starting to understand that yourself." She sets the datapad down in front of me, and on its screen is a record I do not expect to see, a detailed accounting of engagements across the frontier worlds, cross-referenced with dates, unit numbers, and casualty figures. My name appears several times throughout it, attached to battles I have told and retold so many times that the details have long since blurred into legend. "The colony at Farron's Hollow," she says, pointing to one entry. "You've told that story to your entire fleet, haven't you? The one where you walked in alone and took the settlement single-handedly." I do not answer, but my silence is answer enough. "There were 6 of you," she says simply. 6 warriors against 11 armed settlers, most of them farmers who had never held a weapon before that day. 3 of your warriors were injured in the fighting. You were not one of the wounded, and you were not alone. The words land like a physical blow, harder somehow than anything I experienced during the actual fighting outside. I want to argue, to insist that her records are wrong, incomplete, tainted by human bias, but something in the careful, unemotional way she presents the information makes denial feel suddenly impossible. "How would you even have these records?" I say, grasping for anything solid to stand on. "You were not there." "We have satellites your fleet doesn't know we've recovered," she answers. "We have survivors who tell very different stories than the ones circulating through your ranks. And we have soldiers, like the ones standing in this room, who have fought your kind enough times to know exactly how much of what you tell each other is myth built to keep you feeling powerful." I look toward Daniel Cole, the tall soldier who first found me in the ruins, and toward Peter Hale, the younger one who tended my wound only minutes ago. Neither of them looks at me with the hatred I expected. If anything, there is something closer to pity in their expressions, the same pity I once saw in Creel's eyes before I left the fleet, and understanding that connection makes my chest tighten in a way I do not have words for yet. "Why show me this?" I ask finally. "What do you gain from breaking apart stories that were never meant to reach your ears in the first place?" Sergeant Whitfield studies me for a long moment before answering, and when she finally speaks, her voice carries none of the coldness I expect from an enemy interrogating a captured warrior. Because I think somewhere underneath all those stories, there's a soldier who actually wants to understand what he's fighting, she says. And because I've dealt with enough prisoners like you to know that the ones who survive this war, with any part of themselves intact, are the ones willing to hear the truth, even when it costs them everything they thought they were. I do not answer her right away. Instead, I sit in silence, restrained hands resting against the cold metal table between us, and let the weight of everything she has shown me settle slowly through the cracks that have been forming in my confidence since the moment our transport first broke through Aldrin's atmosphere. Outside, somewhere far above this hidden chamber, the battle for the station continues without me, warriors from my own fleet still fighting under the same false certainty I carried into this war only days ago. I wonder, sitting here in the quiet aftermath of my capture, how many of them still believe the stories I told, and how many of them will discover the truth only the way I am discovering it now, stripped of pride, sitting across from an enemy who has shown me more honesty in a single conversation than my own commanders offered across an entire war. Grace Whitfield rises from her seat and gathers the datapad, preparing to leave the chamber, but pauses at the doorway and looks back at me one final time. "Get some rest, Vorak," she says. "Tomorrow, we're going to talk about what happens next, and I think you'll want to be clear-headed for that conversation." She leaves, and the two soldiers stationed near the entrance settle into a watchful silence, leaving me alone with my thoughts for the first time since this war began. I stare at the restraints around my wrists, at the faint scar along my side, where Peter Hale's careful hands closed a wound I barely noticed taking, and I think of Creel's warning, spoken so long ago it feels like it belongs to another lifetime. Be careful what you claim. I understand now, sitting in this quiet chamber, beneath a battlefield I no longer recognize as the war I once described so confidently, exactly how careless I have been, and exactly how much more there still is for me to learn before this war, or whatever remains of the person I believed myself to be, finally comes to its end. Sleep does not come easily in the hours that follow, though the humans do not deny me the chance to try. The chamber stays dim and quiet, the two guards near the entrance speaking occasionally in low voices I cannot fully follow, and I lie against the cold metal frame they have given me, staring at a ceiling built from materials I do not recognize, turning Sergeant Whitfield's words over and over until they lose all shape in my exhausted mind. When morning cycle finally arrives, marked only by a shift change among the guards, Grace Whitfield returns exactly as she promised, carrying the same datapad from before, along with a second device I have not seen yet. "You look like you didn't rest," she says, settling into the seat across from me. I have had better nights, I admit, and something about the honesty of that small confession feels strange coming from me. A warrior who has spent cycles building an entire reputation on exaggeration and pride. She studies me for a moment before speaking again. "I want to try something today. Not an interrogation, a conversation. You've spent your whole career telling stories about killing my people. I'd like to tell you the truth about what actually happened in those battles, if you're willing to listen." Every instinct built through cycles of training and pride tells me to refuse, to insist that my stories need no correction, that a human sergeant has no right to rewrite the legend of Vorak Thessendai. But another part of me, smaller and quieter, remembers the crack that opened in my chest yesterday when she showed me the truth about Farron's Hollow, and that part of me wants, more than anything, to finally understand what has actually happened over the course of this war. "Go on," I say. She begins with the colony at Farron's Hollow again, filling in details she only touched on before. The 11 settlers I claim to have overwhelmed single-handedly were, in truth, a small farming community that had received almost no warning before our fleet arrived. Most of them were not soldiers at all, simply people trying desperately to protect their homes with whatever tools they had available. 3 of them did not survive the attack. The other 8 scattered into the surrounding hills, and it was months before human forces even learned what had happened there. "You told your fleet you fought armed defenders," she says. "You fought frightened farmers, most of whom had never held a weapon before that day, and you were part of a group of 6 warriors, not alone, as you've claimed in every telling since. I want to argue, but the data on her pad, timestamps and satellite images, and testimony from the very survivors she mentioned, leaves no room for the version of events I have built my reputation around. The truth is uglier than my story, I say quietly, understanding this for perhaps the first time in my life. The truth usually is, she answers, without cruelty, simply as a fact laid plainly between us. But it's also more useful. Stories like the ones you tell keep your warriors overconfident and keep the settlers on our side afraid instead of prepared. That fear cost real lives, Vorak. People who might have escaped in time if your fleet's reputation hadn't been built on exaggerations designed to paralyze anyone who heard them. She moves through several more battles after that, each one following the same pattern. The overwhelming victories I described in the feeding halls become, under her calm and careful correction, far messier and more costly engagements than I ever admitted, even to myself. Warriors I claimed fought at my side but barely survived. Settlements I described as quickly conquered that in reality held out for days, inflicting losses that Hive Command quietly buried in casualty reports never shared with warriors like me. Why would Command hide these numbers? I ask, though some part of me is already beginning to understand the answer before she gives it. Because a swarm that knows the truth doesn't charge into battle so eagerly, she says. Fear works both ways, Vorak. Your commanders needed you and warriors like you convinced that humans were weak and disorganized, because that belief kept recruitment high and morale steady. The moment warriors start doubting that story, the moment they start asking how many of their friends really died taking colonies that should have fallen in minutes, the whole system built around your queen's endless campaigns starts to crack. I sit with that thought in silence for a long moment, feeling something shift deep inside me. A foundation I always assumed was solid, finally giving way beneath years of carefully constructed pride. You could have simply killed me the moment I was captured, I say finally. It would have been easier than all of this. Maybe, she agrees, but I've spent this entire war watching your people brought in as prisoners, and every single time, the war doesn't actually end until someone on your side starts telling the truth to the rest of you. I'd rather that happen sooner than later, and I think you might be exactly the kind of warrior your people would actually listen to, once you stop repeating stories you know now are false. Her words settle over me with a weight I do not know how to fully carry. For cycles, I have measured my worth entirely by the size of the stories I could tell, by the fear and admiration they earned me among my own kind. Sitting here, faced with the truth beneath every one of those stories, I do not know who I am without them. What happens to me now? I ask, though I am no longer certain what answer I am hoping to hear. That depends on what you decide to do with what you've learned here, Grace Whitfield says. There's a prisoner exchange being negotiated between your fleet and our command. If it goes through, you'll likely be sent back within the next several cycles. Back to warriors who still believe every story I ever told them, I say, the realization settling cold and heavy in my chest. Yes, she agrees. Which means you have a choice to make before that happens. You can go back and keep telling the same stories, knowing now exactly how false they are, or you can go back and tell the truth, even knowing it might cost you everything you've built your reputation on. I think of Krill, sitting at the edge of every gathering, questioning numbers no one else dared question, watching me with something that was never contempt but always, quietly, concern. I think of the young warrior beside me in the ruins, wide-eyed and frightened, waiting for reassurance built on stories that were never true to begin with. I think of my own reflection in the polished plating of my transport ship, confident and certain, convinced that the hardest part of this war already lay behind me. I do not know if they will listen, I say finally. A warrior who returns from capture, speaking against everything the Hive believes, is not usually welcomed with open arms. No, Grace Whitfield agrees. Usually they're called cowards, or worse. I won't pretend otherwise, But I've also seen what happens when soldiers on your side start asking harder questions, even quietly, even one at a time. It spreads slower than any battle, but it spreads all the same. I look down at my restrained hands, remembering the warrior I was only days ago, boasting easily in a crowded hall, certain of a war I understood far less than I ever admitted. The hive taught me that strength meant certainty, that doubt was weakness to be hidden at all costs. Sitting here now, faced with a truth I cannot unknow, I begin to understand that perhaps the opposite has always been true, that the certainty I clung to for so long was the real weakness, and that whatever strength remains in me now will have to be built on something far harder to carry than pride ever was. I want to see the rest of it, I say finally. Every battle, every story I have ever told. I want the truth, all of it, before I decide what to do with what remains of me. For the first time since my capture, something that might almost be respect crosses Grace Whitfield's expression, and she reaches for the datapad once more, ready to walk me through the remainder of a war I am only now, for the first time, beginning to actually understand. The exchange happens 7 cycles later, in a narrow strip of neutral ground between the last human checkpoint and the waiting shuttles of my own fleet. I walk across that open space slowly, flanked on either side by soldiers who have spent the better part of a week showing me exactly how wrong I was about almost everything I once believed, and I do not know, until my boots actually touch hive soil again, whether I want to keep walking forward at all. Grace Whitfield stands at the edge of the human line as I go, arms crossed, watching without any of the triumph I might have expected from an enemy releasing a captured warrior back to his own side. "Remember what you decided," she calls out, just loud enough for me to hear. The truth doesn't stop being true just because it's harder to say out loud. I do not answer her, but I carry those words with me across the remaining distance, past the waiting line of my own commanders, who greet my return with the kind of relief and celebration I once would have basked in without a second thought. Vorak, the commander who first logged my volunteer name, says, gripping my shoulder with something close to pride, "We feared you lost. Tell us, warrior, how many did you take with you before capture? What did you learn of their defenses?" The old version of myself would have already begun shaping an answer designed to impress, to exaggerate, to rebuild the legend that capture might have slightly dented. Instead, I find myself standing silent for a long moment, the weight of everything Grace Whitfield showed me pressing against every easy lie I could still choose to tell. "I learned that everything I told you before was wrong," I say finally, and the words feel strange and heavy leaving my mouth, like stepping onto ground I am not certain will hold my weight. The commander's expression shifts from relief to confusion, and around us, several warriors who overheard my answer exchange uneasy glances. "Explain," the commander says, his voice carrying a warning edge I recognize from cycles of service beneath officers who do not tolerate weakness in their ranks. I tell him, as plainly as I can manage, about Farron's Hollow, about the 11 farmers, who were never armed defenders, about the 6 warriors, who fought there together, rather than the solitary victory I always claimed. I tell him about the casualty numbers hidden from warriors like myself, about the discipline and adaptability of human forces that our own intelligence reports have clearly understated for cycles. I tell him, finally, about Aldrin Station itself, about a fortified world that held our entire fleet at a standstill for days against defenders we were told would break within hours. By the time I finish, the commander's expression has hardened into something cold and unreadable, and the warriors around us have gone entirely silent, unwilling to meet my eyes. "You return from capture, speaking their propaganda," the commander says finally. "Perhaps they broke something in you down there, Vorak. Perhaps you are no longer fit to carry the reputation you built. Perhaps the reputation I built was never worth carrying in the first place," I answer, and though my voice shakes slightly with the admission, I do not take the words back. He does not strike me, though for a moment I believe he might. Instead, he simply turns away, ordering the other warriors to escort me to quarters, where I am to remain until further review of my capture and return. As I am led away, I catch sight of Creel standing at the edge of the gathered crowd, watching with an expression I finally understand for what it always was. Not pity, recognition. He saw this crack forming in me long before I did, because he had likely walked through some version of this same discovery himself, quietly, alone, long before he ever dared question my stories out loud. The cycles that follow are quiet and difficult. Warriors who once sought me out for stories now avoid me entirely, uncertain whether to treat me as a traitor or simply a warrior broken by captivity. The commanders who once celebrated my reputation now regard me with suspicion, and more than once, I overhear whispered conversations questioning whether I should be permitted to remain among active ranks at all. Creel finds me during one of the rare hours I am permitted outside my restricted quarters, standing near the same viewport where I once looked out at Aldrin Station's star, convinced the hardest part of the war already lay behind me. "You told them the truth," he says, without any need for me to explain what has happened. "And they called me broken for it," I answer. "They called me the same thing cycles ago," Creel says, "when I first started asking questions about numbers that never quite matched the stories being told around me. It did not make the questions any less true." I look at him for a long moment, understanding finally the quiet loneliness he must have carried for cycles, watching warriors like me build reputations on exaggerations he alone seemed willing to question. "How do you continue?" I ask, believing something the entire hive refuses to hear. "Slowly," he answers, "one warrior at a time. You told the truth to warriors who were not ready to hear it today, but some of them heard it anyway, even if they will not admit that to you, or perhaps even to themselves, for cycles yet to come." I think of the young warrior beside me in the ruins of Aldrin Station, wide-eyed and frightened, waiting for reassurance built on stories I now know were never true. I wonder if he heard my confession today, and whether some small part of him has already begun to question the same certainties I once clung to so tightly. Over the following cycles, I remain in a strange position within the fleet, neither fully trusted nor entirely dismissed, a warrior whose reputation for boasting has been replaced by a quieter, more uncomfortable reputation for honesty that the hive does not quite know what to do with. Younger warriors still occasionally approach me, hoping for the old stories, and I give them something different each time, careful and measured accounts of exactly how difficult and costly this war against humanity has actually become. Some walk away disappointed. A few, like the frightened young warrior from Aldrin Station, stay and ask harder questions afterward, questions about casualty numbers, about hidden reports, about whether the Queen's endless campaigns are truly as easily won as Command has always claimed. Creel tells me, quietly, that these small conversations matter more than I understand, that doubt spreads the same way fear once did, slowly and privately, one uncertain warrior at a time, until eventually enough of them begin asking the same questions loudly enough that Command can no longer simply silence it. Months later, word reaches our fleet of a second campaign against a fortified human world, similar in scale to Aldrin Station, and I watch as fewer warriors volunteer eagerly than would have before my return. The stories I once told so confidently no longer carry the same easy weight they used to, and though I cannot claim full credit for that shift, I know that some small part of the doubt now spreading through our ranks traces back to the confession I made on the day I returned from captivity. I think often of Grace Whitfield, standing at the edge of that neutral strip of ground, telling me the truth does not stop being true simply because it is harder to say out loud. I did not fully understand her meaning then. I understand it now, in the quiet, uncomfortable respect I have slowly earned among a small handful of warriors willing to question everything the hive once taught them to believe without hesitation. Somewhere across the stars, on a fortified world I once dismissed as easy prey, human soldiers continue preparing for a war they clearly understand far better than we ever gave them credit for. I do not know how this war will ultimately end, Whether the hive's endless campaigns will eventually break against defenses like the ones I witnessed at Aldrin Station, or whether pride and certainty will simply reassert themselves once memories of my confession fade into the past. But I know this much for certain. Humanity was never the fragile, frightened prey I once described so confidently in crowded halls, eager for admiration I did not deserve. They are something else entirely, patient and adaptive, disciplined in ways that took an entire captured warrior's reckoning for me to finally understand. And somewhere in that understanding, quiet and uncomfortable as it remains, I have found something closer to the truth than any story I ever told, a truth that continues, slowly and steadily, to spread through the ranks of a hive that is only just beginning to realize how much it underestimated the very enemy it once dismissed as beneath its notice.